speaker tonight, as most of you know, is Juanita Salisbury. Juanita is a landscape architect and founder of the Primrose Way Pollinator Garden in Palo Alto. She will be sharing her expertise on how to create a native garden buzzing with pollinators. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to type them in using the chat function on your Zoom screen, and Juanita will address them as time allows at the end of her presentation. Now we would like to welcome Juanita.
Thank you, Leslie. Okay, all right. So here we have the first slide, build it and they will come, creating a native garden buzzing with pollinators. Registered landscape architect, and I also have a PhD in biopsychology. And my area of research when I was in psychology was, and now that I do these pollination gardens, I really see them as the basis of all food intake. So everything does come around full circle. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram, as well as YouTube. It is a great way. I do a lot of back row photography to kind of characterize and record the different species that we see out in our gardens. I'm going to talk about our gardens and then get into the specifics about how to do a habitat garden. We do have the 5 gardens. The first garden was the Primrose Way garden, as you can see here on Google Maps, located along Embarcadero Road.
Juanita?
And yes.
We need to get your program up on the screen. Can you do your share?
Hang on.
You know how to?
Screen share, where is it?
At the bottom of your video, typically in the center, or with a big green share button.
Yeah.
Or
okay.
At the very top.
Yeah, that's nice.
All right. I'm not getting the bar at the bottom.
Might be that you have to exit. If you're in full screen display mode, you might have to exit that to be able to find the Zoom controls. Or they're at a little tiny button at the top.
Yes. Let's see. Bear with me a moment.
I have this problem every third time I present in a meeting, so I certainly understand.
There it is. Okay, share, and then let's go to slideshow and from beginning. How's that? Okay, can you see it now?
Still just getting thumbnails. We're not getting your slides.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
There we go.
Okay, you can hear me. You can see the screen.
Yep.
Okay, very good. All right, so here we go. All right, first slide then. Build it, they will come. So moving on to the next slide. Next, there we go. I'm also getting my internet connection is unstable, so bear with me. So we do have 5 gardens. The first garden, as I mentioned before, is the Primrose Way Pollinator Garden. Here we have Google Maps. Arcadia Place Garden, which is a cul-de-sac garden. Our 3rd garden, Island Drive. Our 4th garden was the Gwynda Street Garden. And then the 5th garden, Hopkins Avenue on Newell Road in back of the fire station in Palo Alto. So the overview tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about our public gardens, how we got these going so that you can do this in your own town with scraps of land that are just waiting to be planted up. I'm going to talk about the plants, why California native plants, the basics of habitat design some basic planting design things in terms of what to plant, and then some basic maintenance protocols. This is a broad overview. There's a lot more information that I can share in an hour, but it's a good place to start. So the Primrose Garden in 2016, this is a before shot. You can see it's a big stretch, about 20 feet wide by 200 feet long on this one side. Nothing but grass, some cherry trees, some camphor trees over on the Embarcadero Road side. And it's literally around the corner from my house, and I was sort of out of room in my own garden for places to plant things, and I saw this as an opportunity. And so I approached the Parks and Open Space people to see if I could design and install a pollinator garden. I offered to do everything, and this is the key: design, site preparation, fundraising, volunteer coordination, installation, and maintenance, very important. They were on board. They said, show us your plan, and I did. And this is a picture of the plan that I did below. And they looked at it, they gave me approval, and we were off and running. We had neighborhood volunteers come out. I set up a GoFundMe site to generate some funds. I managed to get an in-kind donation of boulders. The city was very generous in terms of providing some logs for habitat, and then we did a few weekends of planting. Later, they came back in and put up some signage, which was very handy. And then this is what the garden looked like last spring, and we have over 50 species in this garden. Another view looking down there.
That's it.
Okay, so then came the Arcadia Place garden, again, a cul-de-sac circle, and it's only about 255 square feet, but a lot can be put in to these small areas. We did outreach like we do with all of our gardens for input, and got some funding, and the city provided planting, and so we got that planted up. Island Drive, another opportunity. Here's the before shot. As you can see, ivy, really, and a big tree in the center. And I approached the Happy Hollow Foundation. They have a Progress for Pollinators grant program, and they funded this particular garden, and so we planted that up, and this garden has over 70 native plant species. And I just took that picture a few days ago. The Hopkins garden, I'm skipping Gwenda for a reason. The Hopkins garden, we just planted up in December. It's about 1,000 square feet. Here we have a lot of volunteers out planting that day. Another Progress for Pollinators grant program allowed us to purchase planting for that. And this picture was taken just a couple of days ago. And these plants are growing in record time. So why California native plants? California is a biodiversity hotspot. We have riches in our not agricultural, but our floristic riches. We have almost 8,000 species of plants, some found nowhere else on the planet. We have a lot of species of native bees, about 1,600 species across the state. Honeybees are not native, so I don't really talk about those. And we have such a huge number of native plants. Largely, we have such a big diversity of pollinators. The two are intertwined very closely, and the plants that you see in the natural environment are actually a reflection of the pollinators that are out and present. So, so I plant these gardens for insects, basically, because insects are declining worldwide, and it's looking pretty disastrous for them, and these plants are the way to help combat them. Because plants are the beginning of everything, literally, here on planet Earth. Plants are the primary producers of food. So this is how we get energy from the sun, which comes down in photons. Plants convert those photons into vegetative matter, that are then eaten by insects, the herbivores at this level, and then those tasty packets of protein get transformed into baby birds. And studies have shown that gardens with at least 70% of native plant species are needed to maintain populations of birds, because caterpillars are the preferred food for baby birds. And native insects basically only eat native plants. So this is how you get energy from the sun. You go from the photons to protein, and then the energy is transferred up the food chain. So I look at plants. I don't look at plants as decorations. Back in landscape architecture school, they taught us to shrub it up, which is not really a good way to plant things. I like to have more reasons to choose specific plants. One reason that I chose this plant was because I saw it had been chewed on by caterpillars. So this was a twofer for me. The plant came with some handy protein already. So I'm always looking to see if my plants have been chewed up. This is what plants are for. This is a good sign. Plants that aren't being chewed up, I always wonder why. Are the pollinators not there? Are the larvae not there? What am I not doing correct? So again, 70% are native plants needed to maintain a population of chickadees. And these are photos that I've taken in my own gardens. Some of these, here we have a caterpillar on Scrophularia, another one on Sedelcia, a gray hair streak butterfly actually laying eggs on Eriogonum, and then an Anis swallowtail caterpillar on Proteridia. So, and these larvae, these are the plants that they eat. They don't eat other plants. So this is how you provide food for birds. And let's face it, I mean, the gray hair streak is a beautiful creature. Okay, again, let's talk more about native plants, shall we? So here's the Gwynda garden before. This is also along Embarcadero Road. As you can see, what a sad sight. Covered in ivy, some dead trees, a big valley oak in the back, some random shrubs around a electrical box. Pretty ugly. And this was a couple of weeks ago. We once again applied for grant money and got this planted up. Literally, this site had been ivy for decades. About 1,000 square feet. We have about 30 different species in here. So again, so why do I focus so much on the California natives? As you might suspect, the native plants are largely preferred over non-native plants by pollinators. Native plants depend largely on native pollinators then for reproduction. As I said before, the plants that you see in a natural environment are largely a factor of the pollinators that are there in the environment. And the native plants provide the right nutrients for native insect larval development. The larvae are very chemically specific in terms of what they need to activate certain hormones so that they can grow into big fat caterpillars, turn into butterflies and moths. Non-native plants can escape cultivation, infest natural areas, bring in diseases, exotic pests. And our native plants, with 8,000 species, we can keep California looking like California. And the plants provide an abundance of ecosystem services. So not just transforming those photons into protein, but also providing a lot of resources for other organisms. So when people say, what do we need to plant? A very handy resource, and I'm sure a few of you already know about this, is the calscape.org website and database. And I recently looked at, and you can do searches on this database for specific areas. Here's one for Millbrae. So let's talk about local plants. So what is local in Millbrae? You can do a search here, and for Millbrae, we've got 698 native species available. Plenty to choose from, really. And so they've broken it down nicely into trees, shrubs, perennials, and so forth. So very handy resource to use. But I look at deciding what to plant in a different kind of way. I think about what to plant, but I also think about a more important question. And that question is, who to feed? So consider here that plant species need insects, like pollinators, in order to survive. And we do know that speciation, the changing of a species over time, occurs more rapidly when you have pollinators, because they're spreading around the genetic goodies to other plants actively. So biological factors then become more important than abiotic factors like climate, geology, water, and temperature, and for determining what to plant. And this was actually something that Darwin noted in The Origin of the Species. So this is not a new idea. Again, you can do a search on Calscape for the number of different butterflies and moths native to your location. Here in Millbrae, there are 331 species. You can click on any of these particular butterflies or moths and see what plants they eat and plant them. And if you plant these plants, you will have these creatures coming to your yard to eat them. So the basics of habitat design. I have taken this screenshot from the Calscape planting guide page, and you can see how nicely they've shown about irrigation. And this is very important because moisture is important in our environment. So here you have something deep-rooted like an oak, pulling up moisture from the ground table and then spreading it through the lateral roots and sharing it with other plants. This is something that is very handy if you want to reduce water use in your own garden. I've taken this idea and created my own little drawing in the ways that I like to look at how connected things are. And connectivity is very important in design. So what I mean by connectivity is that everything is connected to everything else. Let's talk about how moisture is connected. Let's say this is the ground line here. It's a big fat line. Let's say you've created a swale. That moist area is going to be prime real estate in your garden. You'll have moisture soaking down into the groundwater area, and then you'll have tap roots pulling that water up into the tree, and then the trees release the water into the air, and you'll have cloud formation. In fact, trees form 1/2 of the water cycle. And you probably remember from grade school days where you saw water evaporating over oceans, clouds heading to the mountains and dropping the water. That's half the story. The other half is through transpiration from trees and shrubs. So connectivity, then you can get it in this vertical direction, and you can also get it in a horizontal direction. So for example, if you have a pile of leaves and twigs and you have a plant that spreads by runners, those runners will go towards the pile of mulch because there's moisture under there. You can layer plants together, and I'm a big fan of layering things together. So in a swale like this, you can put in something like yarrow and then plant bulbs into the yarrow, the geophytes. They're very happy to live together like that. You can have vines crawling up into other shrubs. That's how you really cram a lot of plants into a space. Leaving leaves under trees allows any sort of larvae that have been feeding upon a tree to drop down and overwinter. Also rocks. Rocks create tiny little ecosystems as well and trap moisture in the ground. So connectivity in all directions, not just horizontally, but vertically. So Pinnacles National Park last year, and I went to Pinnacles last year because that is the area in California with the highest concentration of bee species in California. And because plants are a reflection of what's in the environment, I wanted to see how plants kind of were laying out in the environment. And here we have a great combination of Delphinium and Diclostema species in mass like that. And the color blue. Blue is a favorite color of bees. But a great instance of how plants grow together like this. So increases of complexity like that. So some of the basics. To start with, your plant palette should have at least 3 species for each of the early, the mid, and the late bloom times, or the minimum of 9 different species. We have pollinators emerging at different times. They don't all come out at once, because if you have insects all coming out at once, then they use up all the resources. But the species come out at different times because they are connected with the plants that are blooming at that time. They have preferred plants that they go to. So if you have plants that are blooming all during the season, overlapping bloom time, keeps your insects foraging in the garden. When you have a diversity of blooming plants and plant resources, you'll have a diversity of pollinators and other insects. Every plant that you plant, think of that as a specific meal for some species. Research shows that gardens with at least 20 different types of blooming plants is ideal for attracting a diversity of pollinators, and I try to start with at least 20 species in our gardens, and then we keep adding to that. Although some studies indicate that between 60 and 80 species is even better for attracting diverse pollinators. You should have planting occurring in masses of single species of at least 3 feet or more in diameter. That just enhances the foraging efficiency of pollinators because they don't have to spend a lot of time flying between plants. The less time that they spend flying between plants, that means the more pollen and nectar they can collect for their offspring, rather than spending all their time flying around. And then more is better. Masses of plants that are blooming is better because it takes a lot of pollen to create one larva or one bee. One study showed that 85% of 41 bee species required all of the pollen from 30 flowers for one larva. One. Other species required all the pollen from over 1,000.
Interesting.
Stop talking, please.
I know, it's very interesting. I just get so excited myself. And most of our bee species do nest underground, leaving areas of bare dirt for them to be to nest is good, because if you're planting for these organisms, expect that they will nest in your yard. This is what you want. So you're going to have bugs, and that's a good thing. The way to plant up, you start with trees first, then shrubs, then perennials, then bulbs, vines, and so forth. You want to provide abundance. Abundance is the key thing here. You want to provide as much food as possible. One of the plants that we have in just about every garden of some kind of Areogonum here, because this is a plant that a lot of different kinds of insects use. Areogonum fasciculatum, a great low water use plant, larval food for the gray hair streak, but also nectar sources for butterflies, flies, bees, beetles. It's really quite a popular plant with a lot of different kinds of insects. So here's my imaginary habitat. And I drew this picture to illustrate a number of different points. And it's not like really super professional looking or anything like that, but I think it gets the point across. So mostly to scale. So imagine this is 60 by 100 feet deep. Here's the house up here with the door going to the outside. There's a window. If you can't get out to the garden and plant some things, if it's too late to plant, one of the things that you can do to really help in these habitats is to put blackout fabric on all your windows at night to reduce light transmission to the outside. And that's because we lose up to 30% of insects to light pollution each night because they exhaust themselves fluttering towards the windows and they become prey that way. So let's say you have a patio, barbecue area here, maybe a seat wall over here with a couple of arbors. Downspouts on either side of the house that empty out into a swale, okay? And these swales connect up. And then I have some stepping stones going down to a little gazebo and a little vegetable garden over here. One of the things that you want to do in your garden is reduce the amount of paving. Everything that you pave is less area for bees to nest in. So consider the design process then as a nutrient design, or a buffet, as I like to think of it. And trap lining behavior is oriented by a layout of resources. And trap lining is what bees do when they forage in an environment. They follow a path, the same path, over and over again, going to the resources that they find in the environment. And when new resources become available, they slightly diverge from that trap line, where they keep going to resource after resource. It's very stable, very predictable over their lifespan. They do vary that a little bit when other resources become available. Again, you want to aim for at least 20 different plant species, and choosing species for richness of food resources, plants that provide pollen, nectar, and are larval food sources. So you get 3 things out of a single plant. And you want to take advantage of edges. Edges are basically lines in an environment. And this actually helps these small-brained organisms to orient themselves through an environment. They will follow lines. So a line might be your pathway here. A line is at an edge. Okay, so we have masses of plantings, like here's a mass of ceanothus, here's a mass of salvia, here's a big oak tree. Okay, and the names of these plants are written very small, but you can see they're basically big, large clumps of things. And plant at all scales and planes. You want to start with your large trees and shrubs, like your oaks. Always, oaks are great. If you can't put a big one in there, put a scrub oak in, something smaller. We have here a nice big patch of Eriogonum, okay? A big salix, a willow. And people say, oh, I don't think willow will grow. My garden's too dry. I have it in my front yard and I hand water it when I think of it. And it's a really nice resource. So don't be afraid of willows. They're a great resource. And then once you have the big stuff planted in, then put in your smaller stuff and increase complexity over time, because you can't just go in and do this all at once, because things have to get established, and then you can slowly work in other plants. Again, outdoor lighting, probably best not to leave the porch light on outside. Motion sensors are really the best way to go. There's no evidence that outdoor lighting that stays on all night deters crime. Motion sensors, if someone's out there moving around, the lights will come on. Otherwise, really one of the best ways to help is to make sure that you're not having light transmission to the outside at night. How do you do it? It's not that hard. So I always tell people to start off with a piece of graph paper, and graph paper comes in all kinds of different sizes. You can get little squares that 1/8 of an inch equals a foot. You can, or you can get a graph paper that has a square that's 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch equals a foot, whatever. So measure your site, lay out some tapes, show where your house is, where any paving is, show where downspouts are, and then add a north arrow, show which way north is. And once you have that, then you can start adding in structure. Okay, so before you think about any sort of plants, think about how you as a human will be moving through the garden. So lay out your pathways, because you're going to have to get in there and take care of things. And then add plants from your plant palette, okay, as circles at their mature diameter. So you can go on Calscape and take a look to see how big these things get. And these plants will get large, and so draw the circles at the mature diameter. And then the circles should just overlap or barely touch. And you can lay these out in a linear fashion, a big clump like this. Again, in a clump or together is more efficient for for bees to forage. In fact, bees spend most of their time foraging. Bumblebees, for example, when they go back to the nest, only spend between 2 and 4 minutes dropping off their pollen and nectar for the larvae to eat. They spend most of their time out looking for food. And again, leave bare spaces for nesting. So what plants to use and why? Many species are drought tolerant of California native trees. Let's talk about trees here. Trees form these hubs from which wildlife moves around in an area, and they can provide huge sources of nectar and lots of resources for larval species. And as we've seen before, trees are important for taking care of the air and the water. A few of our species that we have here, Quercus agrifolia, many of the oak species, you can't go wrong. Prunus species, and if you go on Calscape and you look at the number of species that eat Quercus, it's amazing. So one-stop shopping for dozens of organisms. And if I have a choice between a plant that feeds 5 organisms to another plant that feeds 30, I'm going to choose the 30 because I want to feed as many bugs as possible. Oh, and you also want to choose wisely. You don't want to have a big oak like this in your side yard. Here, this human here, this is my husband, 6 foot 3 inches tall, dwarfed by this large Quercus agrifolia. You can see how different the environment looks with a landscape without vegetation versus places with big, beautiful trees. Again, trees are helping to save water, forming half the rain cycle, really provide so many services. Start with trees first. Here's a great little picture of a California sister butterfly. They feed on Quercus chrysolepis. Shrubs, you know, this is just a small list of shrubs that we have, and these are some shrubs with substitutes. There's no reason to plant something like Raphiolepis, sorry, Raphiolepis fans, or boxwood, sorry, boxwood fans. You can plant instead Arctostaphylos, Vaccinium ovatum, lots of things that kind of look like boxwood. Ceanothus species, Eriogonum. These I call the big 3, and as you can see, here's an Arctostaphylos over here with a bumblebee feeding on the nectar. Here's another one on an Eriogonum, and then Ceanothus. So lots of choices, really. And all of these we have in our gardens, and except for perhaps maybe the Garryoleptica, but really provides a lot of resources. I like to have a lot of early blooming plants because one of my favorite pollinators are bumblebees. Here in Palo Alto, we have 2 different species that I see regularly. This one is the Bombus melanopygus, the so-called black-tailed bumblebee, a cute little bee butt here. And this Ceanothus valley violet blooms pretty early in January, and she is out because bumblebees can warm up their bodies with their flight muscles. They can come out when it's cold. Some perennials, again, lots and lots of choices here. Every garden should have some kind of Phacelia species, great nectar source here. This Cirsium species, or the thistles, super important in the environment. A lot of them are biennial, act like annuals, and so on and so forth. Lots and lots of insects use these plants. One thing that you can do to really boost your garden in terms of resources, something cheap and easy, are annuals. Seed packets don't cost that much. 3 easy annuals, we have these in our gardens. Poppies. Poppies are wonderful because they provide tons of pollen. They don't have any nectar, but a lot of insects really like that. And bees are the only insects really that use pollen to feed their larvae. Other insects feed their larvae other insects. And then we have Gilead capitata, and then Phacelia tenacetifolia, which provides both pollen and nectar. The nectar is really tasty. Lots of bees will be attracted to it. Here you can see a tiny bee having a pollen snack there on the end. Seeds are great also because you preserve a lot of genetic diversity. Some are so easy. Some of these, like the Gilead capitata, I just throw it on the ground and it comes up pretty quickly. Same with the Phacelia tenacetifolia. Just a quick note about the food, because I like to say it's all about the mealtime. And so, like floral resources for bees, pollen, okay, pollen is the main source of protein for bees. Pollen, all pollen is not created equally. Some bees are very specific on the types of pollen that they feed on, and they won't live, their offspring will not survive on the wrong pollen, which is why diversity is really important. And here we have bumblebees on a number of different plants here. Bumblebees are generalist feeders. So if you plant for bumblebees, chances are you'll probably feed a lot of other insects too. And so Gilead capitata here, Eriogonum grandirubescens, Phacelia tenacetifolia, and so forth. So bumblebees have the longer tongues and prefer tubular flowers, but they aren't super picky. They'll just about eat anything. Go back. Another thing that plants provide is nectar. So if we're not really talking about larvae here, we're talking about things that like sugar, which is pretty much all life on Earth. Everybody loves sugar. And lots of different species will feed on Monardella, which is featured here. We've got skipper butterflies, little bees, big bees, wasps. A great plant. We have this in a few of our gardens as well. So nectar is one of those wonderful resources. The ability to carry pollen. So as I mentioned before, bees spend most of their time out foraging, and bees don't like to travel super far to get to the food and back to the nest. If they have a choice, and if there's abundance close by, they will nest close by. So if you have abundant resources, you will have nests, because it just decreases the amount of time flying. And if you have a shortened amount of time flying, you can have more species that a species will spend more time collecting food and taking it to their nests, and actually will collect more over time if they're close to the source of food. So the main distance is between 150 and 1,500 feet between nest and food. In my own backyard, I have bees literally nesting 10 feet away from the food, but I have a very small yard. So it's very buggy back there. Again, pollen, here's a great picture of a Bombus melanopygus on Valley Violet. You can see she's going after nectar, but her hairs are brushing against the anthers of the plant and the pollen, which plants and bees have opposite electrical charges. So when a bee lands upon a plant, the pollen is attracted to the bee, and then she grooms it from her fur into these little pollen baskets and takes it back to the nest. I have a lot of pictures of bees eating things because I like to see what they're eating, and I like to see how they eat. And so I can tell because this is eating pollen because the mouth is actually on the anther here, and she's collecting pollen in her back legs, but she's also tasting the pollen with her antennae, which I find totally fascinating. And this is Grandelia, which is another great habitat plant. And then another bee, you can see here the mouth parts here, gathering pollen, which she has collected back in her back legs. It's only the females that collect pollen and take care of the offspring. The males don't do anything except for mating, eating, and sleeping, and then they die. And this plant is Salvia apiana, which is super attractive for lots of different kinds of bees. Some other great plants and lots of pictures of bugs eating. Coffee berry, which is pretty tasty, I guess, to this little lady here. Another one on Grindelia, having a pollen snack here. Here we have a leaf cutter on Isocomum and zizii, and another little bee also going after the pollen. Annuals are great for pollen resources too. Clarkia amoena is really nice. Leptosiphon, again, Monardella villosa, even though it provides nectar, it also provides pollen. And of course, poppies. Here we have the maritime poppy with a bumblebee, another small bee, a couple of beetles, real pollen party going on. Asters for nectar, you can see there's the mouth part going in with the tongue. Here also a bumblebee. This looks like some kind of a maybe leaf cutter bee. And another leaf cutter over here, you can tell by the abdomen. And asters, super attractive to a lot of species of bees. Arctostaphylos and lupins for nectar. Here we have a little osmia bee, a blue orchard bee on Arctostaphylos. And then a bumblebee, this is Bombus vosnesenskyii, the yellow-faced bumblebee, with her mouth parts open, her proboscis here where her tongue will come out. She's going after the nectar. Lupins are great. They should be in every garden. Penstemons, again, bumblebees love them for the nectar. Little bees like them. This is another little osmia. And again, Phacelia species for both nectar and pollen. We have 3 different kinds of Phacelia here, Tanacetifolia, which is an annual, Phacelia bullanderi, which is a short-lived perennial, and then Phacelia californica as well, another short-lived perennial. Erigeron species, super easy to grow from cuttings. I mean, you can literally like pinch a little piece off and stick it in the ground and it'll grow, both for pollen and nectar. Also, caterpillars seem to like it too. So a few little bee facts. You know, blue and purple mean nectar to a bee. White and yellow means pollen. They see in the ultraviolet patterns on flowers are very important to orienting things. And I try to keep things as simple as possible in my designs. So masses of things, nothing too crazy in terms of shapes of things because we're dealing with tiny brains. So once you have your garden, how do you keep these organisms alive? In our gardens, we put a lot of time in the first few years to keep the weeds at bay. And then as you keep adding more native plants, you'll find that the weeds don't compete as well. And we irrigate the first 1 to 3 years pretty regularly, and then we dial it back. In our Hopkins garden, we were at 2 days a week with a spray irrigation for about 15 minutes. And now we're cutting it back to once a week. And that garden went in December. So it's already becoming nicely established. In terms of pruning, I always tell people wait to prune because insects do hibernate inside of stems. So you don't want to be cutting down stems because you might be ruining a nest. You don't need to fertilize. We like to mulch to control the weeds to begin with. I like to use leaves because leaves are excellent habitat for larvae to be hiding in. Remember, larvae are food for other bugs. Every bug is really a meal for somebody else. Leave areas of bare dirt for nest. I probably shouldn't have to say this. Don't use pesticides, don't use herbicides, and don't use fungicides. Any sides that are going to kill something is really not necessary. And don't use leaf blowers, please. Leaf blowers blow larvae off of plants and dry out insects and blow them away. And people wonder where all the butterflies have gone. and plus they're just terrible for the environment. Again, leaves as mulch. Breaks down pretty quickly. Here's my dirty glove holding a handful of broken down leaves. If you don't like the way it looks, you can put what I like to call the skim coat of bark chips on the top, 1 chip thick, so it looks like you've really gone to town. And it can be 3 inches deep or less, so nothing crazy. The birds will find the insects, so these piles of leaves are wonderful habitat for insects to get in there and to try to hide from the birds, but the birds know better and find them. Again, bare soil is important. Most of our native bees are nesting underground, so here's a little entrance to a burrow underground, and this is actually out at our Island Drive garden. Here are some of the little denizens that live there, and they forage in this garden. There's really no reason for them to go anywhere. And because they have created a very stable nest, I've decided that we're not going to be digging any holes for new plants. If we want some new plants, I'll do some seeding of things in there. I don't want to disturb the soil structure. Again, pruning decisions. Insects are only adults for a very short time. They're larvae and eggs for a much longer time than they are adults. The adult phase of their lives are for mating and dying, essentially. Mating, laying eggs, and then expiring. And so here in the lower right-hand corner, I'm showing these are katydid eggs on a dried up branch of Scrophularia californica. And these eggs were there for months before they hatched. So if I had chopped this branch off, I would have lost all these katydids. And that's not what I want. That's not the point of the garden, is to keep it tidy and perfect looking. It's actually for insects to get in there and have lots of meals. So again, insects hang out inside of stems. So here we have a little wasp. And this is at our Island Drive garden. We deadheaded some Salvia spatheca. And we had wasps going into these then open stems. And we just piled the stems up in the garden, so if any insects wanted to get in there and use them, they were available. So as I mentioned before, many insects spend a lot of time as an egg or a larva. So handy protein here, protein here. This little fellow on a beautiful poppy actually turns into a nice yellow moth. And other bugs are larvae. It's not just moths and butterflies, but a lot of beetles spend time as larvae as well. So our ongoing decisions, we ask ourselves, you know, I always really try to look at things before I do something because I don't want to interfere with the natural processes. I want to enhance it as much as possible. The most important question for me is, does this plant provide forage for local insect species? Other considerations, how much water is needed? Does it provide nesting opportunities? Is it hard to grow? You know, how does it really enhance the resources in the garden? How connected is this garden to other natural spaces? This is very important to think about. If you're next to a wildland interface, how do you decide what to plant there? Because chances are, if you have seeds that get blown by the wind, they will end up in those natural areas. So I always say, look closely before acting. This is a broad overview of what I have learned are the best practices as I know them today. I'm always reading and researching each plant and the behaviors of the various insects so that I can see what might be a better thing to do next. And so my information is evolving over time because we don't get the whole story at once. And that was nicely illustrated. I was taking a picture of the Silene here, and I was taking it mostly for the pollen, but I later noticed, looking at the photograph, that there was a tiny juvenile katydid staring at me, seeing me before I saw it. did not reveal itself until later, and that's kind of the nature of knowledge. So I know it's a lot of information. Good thing this will be online so you can review at your leisure. Among other ecosystem services that native plants provide and the habitats that you can have with these gardens, you'll get to see magnificent interrelationships, and you'll see things that are more complex than you can imagine. And for me, the more I understand, the deeper my compassion for all living things. And that I will leave you with this final photograph. And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Wonderful presentation, Juanita. I loved it.
Thank you.
Yeah, if anybody has questions, feel free to type them in. I'm not sure there have been any submitted type questions. Is that correct, Leslie?
Janet, you were very soft. You might want to say that again.
If anybody has questions, feel free to type them in your chat. I don't think anybody has submitted any questions. Is that correct?
Correct.
But there is one. There is one right now. How is the maintenance organized?
So the maintenance is a little bit at a time. And right now it's difficult because we're all trying to avoid each other. So I will go out once every couple of weeks and spend a little bit of time pulling out some of the more egregious weeds, and some of the other wonderful volunteers that I have as well will go in. So it's not terribly organized. Before all of this pandemic fun started, I would go out several times a week to see what needed to be done. But I really take a real hands-off approach to these gardens because I don't want to interfere with the natural processes. So I do weed a little bit at a time, so it doesn't really build up over time, and the maintenance is actually quite low. If things start to look untidy, like the annuals have completely gone to seed and have dried out completely, then we'll go in and harvest seeds and kind of cut them back and leave stems in place. You know, I try to mimic the natural environment as much as possible, and those areas, like in parks and wilderness areas, are not maintained. But the main thing is really just keeping the weeds at bay.
Someone asked if the figwort is beneficial to pollinators when planted in dry shade.
Absolutely. Figwort, the Scrophularia californica, is one of my favorite plants. That plant is pretty hard to kill, and it provides a ton of nectar, and it's also a wonderful larval food source as well. It's a great plant. We have it in every garden but the Arcadia garden, which is a little too small for it because it does get rangy. I actually have it in my home garden in 2 different locations, and it is the spot for pollinators. They love it.
Yes, and I personally have it in dry shade in my front yard. What kind of model or camera do you use for these fantastic photos?
So, you know, that's a great question. And it was a question that I had when I first started looking at macro photography. So I asked some of the other bug photographers what they used. And what people use is, what I use actually is the Canon 80D, the EOS 80D. And I use a macro lens on it. And I take about, when I go out to photograph, I take about 300 pictures till I can find one that's actually in focus.
I've heard that before. The secret to good pictures is taking lots of them.
3 to 500, yes.
if you had about 10 square feet to work with, shade in the morning and afternoon with sun midday, you have top recommendations for plants.
Oh, absolutely. So one thing that might be nice to put into a small area like that for a tree would be Cercocarpus betuloides, the mountain mahogany, a great plant. Certainly that could go in there. And you can put in some ceanothus as well as arctostaphylos and some eriogonum, the big three. And then you can sprinkle in some bulbs. You can sprinkle in some of the smaller annuals, some vines to crawl up through things. If you don't have room for a big gigantic bush lupin, you could try an annual lupin and try seeding those in as well.
And someone asked, where are good places to buy, collect native plants?
So for buying plants, Callscape has a handy reference, so you can see what nurseries offer these plants, and you can click on a link and it takes you to the nursery webpage where most of these places have availability lists, so you can save yourself a trip to see if they have something. I also raise things from seed myself, and you're not actually allowed to collect plants in parks and things like that, but some people do collect plants along roadways. That's where some people do that sort of thing. Yeah, seeds are great if you want to spend some extra time growing some things from seed. That's nice. The California Native Plant Society also has plant sales as well. Here in Palo Alto, there's the Summer Winds Nursery, which has both non-natives and native plants. Really a great native plant section in there. That one's close by, lots of different places. I have a lot of favorites, really too many to mention here.
I can also put a plug in. The California Native Plant Society has a nursery at Hidden Villa, and right now they're making deliveries to homes. They are not currently open, but they will make deliveries. You can go to their website and see what plants they have available. I wear more than one hat. Next question. Is the community supportive of having insects and bees in the areas, or are they not next to housing?
So these are in residential areas, and the first garden, the Primrose Garden, the whole neighborhood actually came out to plant it up, and the neighborhood loves it. The other neighborhoods that we have gardens in have been extremely supportive. Last year we generated a newsletter to the houses that are close by to these gardens so that we could tell people who we were, remind them, and to give them some information. And whenever I'm out working in the gardens, or some of the volunteers, people who are walking by thank us. So the response has been really great from the communities for the gardens that are installed. And one of the things that I find especially nice is that people bring their kids to these gardens, the little kids that like to see nature, because some of the gardens are very wild, and you know, in town here, there just aren't enough opportunities to be in a wild place right outside your front door. And it's just nice to be able to provide that to these various neighborhoods. And you know, as far as I can tell, people really seem to like the gardens that we have installed.
Thank you. We have a question about how you irrigate these areas. Do you have drip, or what do you do?
So each of these areas had existing spray irrigation. In the Hopkins garden that we just installed, the city modified the irrigation according to my recommendations. And I personally prefer it to drip irrigation because I think it mimics natural rainfall better. And it's easier to maintain. I think sometimes if you can't see where the the drip lines are, or something is above the ground. Squirrels get in there, chew up drip emitters, things get clogged up, and it's just easier. And so I keep a close eye on what things look like in the gardens if they're not getting irrigation. I talk to the very wonderful supportive people at Parks and Open Space who I liaison with, and they adjust the schedules for me accordingly.
So do you cut off irrigation after a few years, or are they on spray all the time?
We probably will never cut off the irrigation completely. We'll probably continue to irrigate maybe once a week, but we'll decrease the amount of time. And the irrigation isn't completely random. It is there is a pattern to it. So we take advantage of the best spots for plants that like a little bit moister areas closer to the spray heads, and then things that like it drier further away.
Next question. After collecting the seed, do you reseed in the autumn, or do you sprinkle the seeds right away?
So I usually wait until after the first rain. You know, anytime in the fall you can seed things. And seed is funny. Some of it comes up very quickly, like the first year. Some things don't sprout for several years. And that's just the way that they evolved. And so like poppies, for example, they don't always come up the first year, which is interesting. Other things, I experiment with a lot of different kinds of seed, and some are easy and really abundant, like Gilead capitata, which I harvest by the poundful. And that one I just throw on the ground and it sprouts. Other things, I do some cold moist stratification so that I can see how long it takes for things to sprout. And then I'll raise some things in pots so I know what the seedlings look like, so I don't inadvertently weed them out.
Okay, someone had a question, which I had. Any reason you don't choose or didn't choose Gary elliptica?
We just don't have the space for it in some of the gardens.
You said
I'm
something
always-
in your talk about it not being especially good for insects.
Oh, I just mentioned we just don't have it. It was on our list. We just don't have it in our gardens. I would love to use it. You know, it's just, it can get really big, and some of our spaces aren't that huge. And I would much rather plant oaks than Gary elliptica. You know, it's a space issue, basically. Oaks get bigger and they provide more. But it's a wonderful habitat plant as well. It's very ornamental looking, you know, and maybe with some of the next gardens we can include it. For me, it's always a difficult challenge to try to decide what to plant, because I like all the plants. I want them all, and I want them all in my gardens. I'm kind of obsessed that way. I'll get around to Daria.
We all understand that challenge.
Yes.
Especially us in the horticulture world. Someone asked, how do you get rid of the established ivy in these plots?
Well, you know, I really thought it would be harder to get rid of. So at the Island Drive Garden and also the Gwynda Street Garden, the city had somebody come out and remove it for us. They tilled it up and grubbed it out, and then they put about a foot of mulch down. And at the Gwynda Street Garden, which is a couple of years old, it comes up here and there, but we keep yanking it out. It's slowly giving up. It's kind of wimpy, actually. And at the Island Drive Garden, I think I may have seen 1 or 2 sprigs over the last year. So it gives up pretty easily. You might see it pop up here and there occasionally, but not to anthropomorphize, but it seems like it knows that it's unwelcome, and it's actually getting to be less of a problem at the Gwynda Street Garden, which had ivy for at least 60 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's old ivy. Someone else asked, and you mentioned not to water when it's hot. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, so watering during hot weather is not really what happens in California. It doesn't really rain when it's hot here. And so you can end up with encouraging soil pathogens that can kill some of the good bacteria in the soil that are necessary for plants to be happy. So if you want to water on the cooler days, or water when it's when it's in the evening, when it's cooled down, just don't water when it's like 100 degrees outside, if you can at all avoid it. I'm sure that people are thinking, but there's that one day when something was all wilted. That happens, but try to avoid it as much as possible.
But in your landscapes, you had sprinkler systems that ran once a week?
Yes, so the sprinkler systems at the public gardens come on at like 4 o'clock in the morning for about 15 minutes once a week.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Yep.
Someone else asked, does the Calscape website give you the botanical names from the commons so that I could locate figwort?
Yes, you can search by the common name.
And one last one here. Have you had other established perennial weeds that were hard to remove, and how did you manage them?
Well, yes. So many horrible weeds. Do I even have to say it? Oxalis, the weed from hell. And so that one is particularly annoying. And, I don't use herbicides, and I've tackled that one in a number of different ways. One of the ways in my own home garden that I try to get rid of it is I let it sprout and grow nice and fat. And before the seeds can pop, then I yank it right out. And that does not go into the compost, my home compost. That goes into the city's compost, and they can deal with that. Some people like to use sheet mulching, and I'm a little bit wary of sheet mulching, mostly because I don't want to cover up any bee nests that might be in the soil. I don't want to make it harder for the bees to get in and out of the places if they're nesting in the soil. I tackle weeds constantly, but a little bit at a time so it doesn't become overwhelming.
Sounds like a good plan. Can a scrub oak, do you know anything about growing scrub oak? Can it be happy in a residential garden in a limited space? Does it want to be big? And can it take some pruning to keep within range?
Scrub oak. I actually have it in a big pot in my home garden. We also planted a scrub oak over at the Hopkins garden, and they won't get super huge, but you can prune them to shape if you need to. The one that's been in the pot in my home garden has been pretty happy in there for about 3 years now.
So scrub oak could be a way to add oaks to a small space.
Absolutely.
Sounds good.
Yep.
I don't see any more questions here.